Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal boarded Flight 392 to give his daughter the trip of a lifetime, not to fight for her right to breathe. But when a flight attendant throws out his 10-year-old's life-saving medicine, without warning, Shaq doesn't argue. He doesn't yell. He locks the plane from the inside and grounds an entire system. What started at 30,000 feet just shook the nation. She just needed her inhaler. That's all. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The airport was buzzing in the way all airports do on a weekday afternoon. Families rushing, voices echoing, wheels skimming across tile. But inside Gate B-17 at Hartsfield-Jackson in Atlanta, it was quieter. Not silent, but hushed, like the calm before something you can't quite name. Shaquille O'Neal stood out, as he always did. He wasn't trying to, but at 7 feet tall with a frame that seemed carved from stone and a smile soft enough to hold in your hand, Big Shaq didn't fade into any background, not even in a place this big. He wore a gray hoodie, worn in and wrinkled at the sleeves, the kind you keep because it's been there through too much to throw out. His daughter Jabria clung to one of its arms like it was the only steady thing in the world. She was 10, small for her age, with tight curls pinned back into 2 puffs, and a lavender backpack covered in stickers, unicorns, glitter stars, and one patch that read "Breathe." Shaq had made her that patch himself. After her second hospitalization last year, he stitched it by hand. He wasn't a seamstress, far from it, but he was a father whose world could go sideways in 60 seconds if his daughter's lungs betrayed her. They were headed to New York, not for business, not for a game, not even for charity. This time, it was for joy. Jabria's favorite singer was performing in Central Park, and Shaq had promised, "If you keep those grades up, we'll be front row." She had, and he was a man of his word. They were early. Shaq always was. They sat quietly near the windows, watching planes land like mechanical birds. Jabria sipped apple juice through a bendy straw. Her nebulizer kit rested at her feet in a small black pouch. Inside it were the tools that kept her chest from tightening too far, too fast. 3 inhalers, one for daily use, one for emergencies, and one custom mixed from her specialist. A backup mask, a digital monitor, and a letter from her doctor laminated in case any TSA agent got too curious. Shaq had packed it himself, double-checked everything, triple-checked the meds. This wasn't just travel, this was protection. He'd told her what he always did before a flight. "Keep your meds close. If anything feels weird, tell me. We good?" She had nodded like she always did, and like always, he kissed the top of her head and smiled down at her. But not everyone at Gate B-17 smiled back. Colette Jennings was there too, early 40s, crew-cut blonde with pinched lips and tired eyes, a veteran flight attendant with decades of flying but a bone-deep impatience for things she didn't understand. She'd watched the two of them arrive, watched the way people reacted, taking photos of Shaq from behind bags, whispering his name like it wasn't obvious who he was. She watched him laugh at something his daughter said, watched them sit on the ground when seats filled up, and something twisted behind her eyes. The thing about people like Colette is they never admit what they're thinking, but it seeps out, in the way they purse their mouths, the way their eyes flick down at a child's backpack, like it doesn't belong, in the way they treat protection as presumption, like planning for your survival is an inconvenience to their comfort. The boarding call came through like honey, too sweet to trust. First-class passengers may now begin boarding. Shaq wasn't in first class. Not today. He'd given his upgrade to a young mom traveling with 2 infants, said she needed it more. He and Jabria waited for their group to be called. He was fine with that. That's who he was now. Post-NBA Shaq wasn't chasing private jets or limelight. He was chasing peace. When they finally boarded, the flight was already tense. Someone's toddler was screaming in row 9. Overhead bins were nearly full. People were pretending not to see each other as they elbowed past. Shaq ducked as he entered the aircraft, guiding Jabria in ahead of him. She found their seats, 22C and 22D, aisle and window, and reached up to place her medication bag into the overhead. That's when Colette appeared beside them like a storm cloud. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "That bag will need to be checked if it won't fit fully inside the bin." Shaq stepped in calmly. "It's a medical kit. It stays with us. I'll make it fit." Colette gave him a tight smile. "FAA policy requires that all items be stowed safely. If you can't make it fit, we'll need to remove it." Jabria's hands trembled slightly. Shaq felt her small fingers press into his back. "I've flown with it a dozen times," he said, voice even. "We're good here." He adjusted the position of the bag gently, easing it against the back wall of the compartment. It fit snug but secure. Colette didn't like that, not because it was unsafe, but because he hadn't let her win. Shaq took his seat, pulled the safety card from the pouch, showed Jabria again how to use the oxygen mask if it dropped. He always went over it, every time. She leaned her head on his arm, breathing calm. He didn't see Colette's eyes narrow, didn't see the brief glance exchanged with another crew member, didn't see her mouth form the words, "I'll take care of it." The flight began to fill. Noise, movement, more stress. Shaq stood up briefly to step toward the front. Someone had texted about a delay at the destination, and he wanted to confirm with a gate agent before they were locked in. He turned back once before exiting. "You good?" he asked Jabria. She gave him a sleepy thumbs up. Her bag was still in the bin. Everything seemed fine. But 5 minutes is enough to ruin a life. Colette moved quick. She unlocked the bin, took the bag, and disappeared to the front of the aircraft. One passenger watched, an older black woman in a church hat, but said nothing. People didn't say things when uniforms made moves. They trusted that badges and badges adjacent meant truth. The medicine bag was dumped behind the first-class closet, next to an ice bucket. When Shaq returned, he noticed the bin was closed. Sat down, didn't realize anything had changed. Not yet. Jabria reached up to check something, opened the bin, paused. "Daddy," she whispered, "where's my bag?" Shaq blinked. "What?" She pointed. It was gone. He stood up, slow, checked another bin. Nothing. His eyes narrowed. "Where is it?" he asked the attendant standing nearest. She shrugged. "I think the lead made a call. Said it was non-compliant." Something hot pressed behind his eyes. He turned toward the front. "Excuse me," he said. Colette was at the galley, organizing service carts like nothing had happened. "My daughter's bag," Shaq said, keeping his voice even. "Where is it?" Colette didn't look up. "Oh, that. It was obstructing the overhead. Against policy. I had it removed." "Removed where?" She shrugged. "Where all non-compliant baggage goes." He stared at her. It wasn't baggage. It was medical. She turned, finally meeting his eyes. "If it was that important," she said, "maybe you should have kept it under the seat." That's when the edges of reality began to bend. The floor didn't shake. The cabin didn't scream. But something shifted. In that moment, Big Shaq knew this flight was never going to take off the way they expected. And the skies? They weren't safe. Not for his daughter. Not today. Not unless he did something about it. She didn't see a child. She saw a problem. It started with a look, not long, not loud, but sharp like a hidden edge. Colette Jennings had the kind of gaze that sliced while smiling, a practiced expression of customer service painted over something colder. As passengers flowed onto Flight 392, she stood at the front like a gatekeeper rather than a guide, scanning boarding passes and managing people like they were problems to be minimized. She'd been doing this job for 19 years, and somewhere along the way she stopped seeing families and started seeing disruptions. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just a large man in a sweatshirt to her. He was a disruption, and his daughter, an accessory to it. Jabria walked just ahead of her father, hugging the straps of her backpack. Her sneakers had pastel streaks, and there was a fresh band-aid on one knee. She moved carefully, her breathing already a little tight from the rush to board, but she didn't say anything. Her medicine was close. She had her dad. That was enough. They turned into row 22, an aisle near the rear of the plane, away from the bustle of first-class comfort and cabin crew chatter. Shaq motioned to the window seat, letting Jabria climb over and get settled. She was small, but the plane still felt smaller. The air was thick, already warm from too many bodies in close quarters. She didn't like that. Her lungs didn't either. Shaq reached into her backpack and pulled out the black medical pouch. It wasn't flashy, didn't call attention to itself, but it was obviously something important. Structured, labeled, zipped with care. He handed it to her, and she held it with both hands, waiting for his signal. He nodded toward the overhead bin, letting her be independent. She liked that. He liked letting her try. She stood on tiptoes, easing the bin open. A few bags were already there, but space remained. She lifted her pouch, careful not to bump the roller bag beside it. It fit, not perfectly, but securely. Her small fingers adjusted the straps so nothing dangled. And then Colette appeared behind them, not loudly, not rudely, but wrong. "That one's too bulky," she said without introduction. Shaq looked up, calm but alert. "It's her medical kit. It always goes with us." "It doesn't fit standard dimensions," Colette replied, eyes still on the pouch. "We'll need to store it elsewhere." Shaq stood up fully now, filling the aisle. His voice was even. "It's been approved on every flight we've taken. That's her emergency medicine in there." Colette gave a smile without warmth. I understand that, sir. But there are safety protocols. The way she said sir wasn't respectful. It was a muzzle. Jabria looked down, shrinking in her seat. She didn't want to cause trouble. She never did. She could feel her chest getting tight, not from asthma yet, but from tension, the kind that pressed from the inside out. Shaq gestured toward the bin. It's in. It's secure. It's fine. Colette didn't back off. She took a step forward, inspecting the pouch like it was a threat. Other passengers will need space too. Perhaps you can hold it under the seat. He shook his head. It can't be compressed. There's medical equipment in there that needs to stay upright. She looked at the bag again. Not a child's lifeline. Just an obstruction. It's not an approved container for onboard medical devices, she said, not making eye contact now. If there's an issue, the gate agent can— There is no issue, Shaq cut in, still composed. We've flown 27 times with that exact setup. Your handbook will back me up. You can check it if you need. There was silence for a moment. The kind of silence where choices are made, where prejudice decides to cloak itself in policy. And Colette made hers. Fine, she said curtly, turning on her heel. Just make sure it's not shifting during takeoff. Her tone said everything her words didn't. And then she was gone. Shaq sat back down slowly. Jabria leaned into his side, and he draped his arm over her shoulder. You okay? He asked, his voice low. She nodded, but she didn't look up. Her fingers tugged on the sleeve of his hoodie, grounding herself. He kissed her forehead again. Not out of habit this time, out of need. She didn't say what she was thinking, but he knew. She was wondering what she had done wrong. That was the problem. Always wondering that. More passengers boarded, filling in the gaps around them. The energy shifted again. Someone behind them grumbled about legroom. A mother up front tried to quiet a screaming toddler. The flight attendants moved briskly, checking belts, organizing trays. But Shaq's eyes kept drifting toward the front, where Colette was working silently with another crew member, whispering something near the galley. He felt it, that tingle in the spine, the one you get when you know something's been set in motion without your permission. He turned to Jabria. You're still good? She nodded again. Still no smile, still holding that small silence in her lungs. Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, unlocking it and opening a game she liked, something with puzzles and bouncing dots. She took it from him gently, leaned back and tried to distract herself. He watched her for a moment longer. His fingers tapped the edge of his armrest. Something felt wrong, but not loud enough to chase. Not yet. Meanwhile, Colette walked back toward the front, whispering once more to a young male attendant. Eric was stitched on his tag. His eyebrows twitched at whatever she said. He looked toward row 22 briefly, then looked away. The same glance people give when they've already made up their minds. Shaq didn't notice that exchange. Not yet. He was watching the cabin fill. Watching how people moved around his daughter. How they looked and then looked away. It wasn't that they saw danger. It's that they saw difference. Her blackness. His size. Their presence in a space people still pretend is neutral. But airports weren't built neutral. Planes weren't designed equal. And flying while black, especially with a child, meant carrying a silent armor no one else could see. Somewhere near the front, Colette took a clipboard from the pilot's door and began checking a box. She didn't look back again. She didn't need to. The pre-flight announcements began. The cabin lights dimmed slightly. The safety video played. And Jabria, still breathing fine, still holding her game, didn't know that her lifeline, sitting just inches above her, was about to be removed. She didn't see Colette slide quietly up the aisle moments later. Didn't feel the shift of the bin above her opening. Didn't hear the pouch being taken by hands that never asked. She only noticed when she glanced up, a moment of reflex, and saw the space above her now empty. She didn't say anything at first, just stared. Shaq caught the expression. He followed her eyes. He stood, quickly. He opened the bin. Empty. His eyes scanned the row, then the aisle. His voice came quieter than expected. Where's the bag? A flight attendant passed nearby. Not Colette. A younger woman named Naomi. She blinked, uncertain. Bag? My daughter's medical pouch. It was right here. She looked confused. Maybe it was moved up front? Shaq turned to Jabria. Did anyone touch it? She hesitated, then nodded slowly.
She came back.
Shaq's heartbeat slowed to a heavier thud. When? Jabria looked down. Right after the game started. He turned toward the front. The seatbelt sign hadn't lit yet. Engines hadn't started. There was still time to fix this. He stepped into the aisle, tall and careful. He didn't rush, but every step felt like a countdown. He passed rows of quiet faces, Some looked up, others didn't. It's always easier not to get involved. At the front, Colette was pouring a cup of water from a plastic pitcher. Shaq stopped just short of her. "Where's my daughter's medical bag?" She turned, slowly, not startled, not apologetic. "I had it removed." He blinked. "Removed where?" "It was a safety obstruction," she said, matter of fact, "so I followed protocol." He stared at her. "Where is it now?" "I believe it was placed in the front bin area, possibly handed to baggage." He didn't speak right away. The silence between them wasn't loud. It was dangerous. Not because he was threatening, but because something had broken. A line had been crossed, not out of accident, but intention. She didn't see a child who needed care. She saw inconvenience. And now the sky, which was supposed to be a place of escape, of celebration, of normalcy, had turned into something else entirely. What do you do when someone throws away the thing keeping your child alive? There are moments when time moves normally. Clocks tick, pages flip, and schedules guide your pace. Then there are moments when time splits in two. The world keeps spinning, but something inside you freezes, forever locked in the moment a line gets crossed. This was that moment. And it began not with shouting, not with a scene, but with Shaq's phone buzzing, just as the last call for boarding closed over the speakers. The number blinking on the screen read, "Foundation Office." It was routine. A check-in about a youth center donation in Newark. Just a few clarifications from his team. He stepped into the jet bridge, just feet away from the boarding door, keeping the conversation brief, his eyes still halfway on the aircraft, halfway on his daughter seated in row 22. From where she sat, Jabria could see her dad pacing gently by the glass, nodding, hand tucked into his pocket. She relaxed a little, eyes drifting back to her screen. Her breathing was steady again. Normal. She wasn't worried. She had everything she needed, or so she thought. Colette, meanwhile, hovered mid-cabin. She had already decided that the presence of the black medical pouch was an issue, not because of its size, but because of what it represented. Disruption, inconvenience, control that wasn't hers. So when she saw Shaq step off the plane, even for a few minutes, she acted with the precision of someone who had done this kind of thing before. Not this exactly, but the passive kind of harm people often call policy. Without asking, without alerting, without documentation. She returned to row 22, saw that Jabria's attention was on her game, and quietly reached into the overhead bin. The bag felt heavier than it looked. Her fingers curled around it, lifting it out without a word. Jabria glanced up, confused. "Excuse me," she said softly, more of a question than a protest. "It's fine, sweetheart," Colette said with a practiced smile, one she reserved for moments where she knew she was wrong, but also knew no one could stop her. "We're just relocating it." Jabria's eyebrows furrowed. Her lips parted to say something else, but her voice caught in her throat. She didn't want to be rude. Her dad always told her to speak up, but also to stay calm. That not everyone would see her as a child. That sometimes people looked at kids like her and only saw weight. Colette walked the aisle swiftly, bag in hand. She passed other flight attendants who didn't question her. She reached the front of the aircraft and veered left into the galley, slipping the bag behind a catering drawer and next to a stack of beverage crates. No labels, no care, just another item to be handled. It didn't matter that it held a prescription-only nebulizer custom-made for pediatric care. Didn't matter that the dosage was personalized. All she saw was clutter. Back in row 22, Jabria sat stiff, eyes still fixed on the overhead bin. Something felt off. She could feel her breath growing shallower again. Not from asthma this time, but something harder to name. A kind of tightening she didn't have a tool for. She wanted to get up and look, but her dad had told her to stay buckled once they settled. She trusted that he'd fix it, whatever it was. Shaq ended the call minutes later, and stepped back onto the plane, just as the cabin doors sealed with a muffled thunk. He nodded at the flight attendant near the door, then headed back to his seat. When he reached row 22, Jabria looked up immediately. "Daddy," she whispered, tapping the overhead compartment. She took it. "Took what?" She pointed. "The bag." Shaq opened the bin. Empty. He checked the adjacent compartments. Still nothing. His voice came quiet but low, a sound that meant the world had tilted just a bit too far. "Who?" "The lady," Jabria said, already nervous. "The one from earlier." He turned slowly toward the front of the plane. The cabin around him remained in motion, passengers scrolling on phones, others fitting carry-ons into tight spaces. But Shaq didn't see them. He only saw the narrowing aisle ahead, and at the far end, Colette moving with the casual energy of someone who thought she'd gotten away with something. He walked with calm purpose, not fast, but not hesitating either. As he approached, she turned, sensing him before he spoke. My daughter says you took her medicine bag. I relocated it, Colette said, already defensive. It was obstructing overhead space. To where? Front galley. What bin? She blinked, then hesitated. It may have been placed for gate check, if it couldn't be safely stored. The words hit him like a steel plate. Gate check. That meant baggage claim. That meant cargo hold. That meant a thin-walled bay with no regulation for medical integrity. Pressurized, yes, but unmonitored. That meant no access during flight. He breathed out slowly, anchoring himself. That's her emergency kit, nebulizer, backup meds, all temperature sensitive. Sir, I followed protocol. No, he said, a hair louder. You didn't. You made a choice. She didn't respond. Her body stiffened, like a child caught with a broken vase. But her eyes, still cold. Shaq turned around and walked quickly back to his row. Jabria's fingers trembled. Her face was pale now. He knelt beside her. Baby, you feeling tight? She nodded. A little. He pulled her close, checked her watch monitor. Her pulse was rising. Try the rescue inhaler, he said softly. She opened her backpack, fumbled. Her hands stopped. It's not here. He closed his eyes for a split second, then stood. The plane wasn't moving yet, but it would soon. And when it did, they'd be trapped. They thought he'd just sit down. They didn't know who they'd messed with. Shaq stepped into the aisle just as the pilot announced pre-flight instructions. Flight time to LaGuardia approximately 1 hour 55 minutes. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride. But Shaq didn't sit back. He didn't relax, and he didn't enjoy any of what was unfolding. He walked past rows of passengers. Some noticed him now. He wasn't smiling anymore. His voice when he reached the front was low, deliberate. I need that bag. Now, Colette, busy organizing safety pamphlets, barely looked up. Sir, I told you. I'm not asking again. A pause. Then she said something she'd regret. You're creating a disruption. Shaq leaned in closer, but not threatening. His height already did enough. His voice stayed quiet. You removed my daughter's emergency medication. She has asthma. That bag isn't a carry-on. It's her life. I'm sorry, but once an item is moved to baggage. He raised a hand slowly, palm up. No, you're not sorry. You just didn't think we'd make noise about it. She opened her mouth to reply, but he turned away, speaking directly to the flight crew intercom. I'm requesting a hold. My daughter's medical equipment was wrongly removed. We cannot take off without it. The pilot's voice cracked over the speaker. Sir, please take your seat. We're on schedule. Shaq stayed standing. Passengers turned now, whispers moving like sparks. Phones were quietly raised. A few started recording. Jabria watched her father from the aisle, her chest rising faster now. She clutched her hoodie sleeve, her face pale. Sir, this is your final warning, came a voice, another attendant, more authoritative. Shaq turned to them, still unmoving. I'm not letting this flight take off while my child is in danger. Call who you need. But I'm not sitting down. And just like that, tension rippled through the fuselage. You could feel it, the pressure of confrontation without violence, the stillness before escalation. But Shaq didn't flinch. He wasn't threatening. He was protecting. His voice was steady, his stance rooted. Behind him, Colette was no longer smug. She looked past him at the watching eyes, at the phones, at the discomfort of a cabin now fully alert to her decision. The pilot's voice returned. We're holding at the gate. Shaq didn't move. Someone clapped, just once, then stopped. Someone else whispered, that's Shaquille O'Neal. But Shaq didn't care who knew him. He wasn't a celebrity right now. He was a father, and his daughter couldn't breathe. He stood there like a statue, calm, immovable. And as the cabin sat in frozen suspense, Colette finally realized something too late. This man wasn't going anywhere. The passengers knew what happened. But would they speak? The cabin had never been quieter, not truly silent, but hollow in that eerie electric way a room gets when people feel danger but aren't sure where to look. The air hadn't cooled, but it felt colder. Engines hummed softly beneath them. The doors remained sealed. The plane hadn't moved an inch, but it was already somewhere else entirely, suspended, tense, waiting. Shaq stood like a monument in the center aisle. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't shouting. He was just there, present in a way most people didn't know how to be anymore. One hand rested against the overhead, the other curled into a loose fist by his side. Behind him, Jabria's small frame was tucked in the curve of her seat, her chest visibly rising faster than before. though she tried to mask it. He turned halfway toward the rest of the cabin, voice steady but not soft. Did anybody see it? Anyone? Did anyone see her take the bag? Eyes shifted downward, sideways, toward seatbelt signs. No one answered. Not at first. He took a breath. You don't need to testify. I'm just asking. Did anyone see the flight attendant remove a small black medical bag from the overhead right above my daughter's seat? Still silence. A man in 14A looked out the window. A teenager wearing noise-canceling headphones suddenly tapped at his phone like it required urgent attention. A woman in business slacks closed her eyes like she had drifted off too quickly to be real. Shaq's voice tightened, not with anger, but with a sorrow that came from knowing this wasn't new. My daughter has asthma. That bag wasn't optional. It was the difference between safe and scared. I'm not asking for outrage. I'm asking for truth. And still, the cabin gave him nothing. It wasn't that they didn't know. It was that they knew too well. What speaking up might cost. How quickly you could be labeled a problem, a disruptor, a liability. Especially on planes. Especially when your skin meant something to people before your words did. He looked to the back rows, then to the front. And then finally someone moved. Seat 19C. A woman in her late 30s. Dark brown skin, curly hair pulled into a neat bun. Hospital badge still clipped to her bag on the floor. She stood, steadying herself with the back of the seat in front of her. I saw it, she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. I saw the flight attendant remove the bag. I didn't know it was medical equipment, but I saw her take it and walk to the front. Shaq exhaled, not in relief, but in recognition. Finally, someone. The woman took a half step into the aisle. My name's Devin Creed. I'm a nurse. I work in pediatric respiratory care. If that bag had emergency meds in it, and it was tossed or stored wrong. Colette snapped to life at the front of the plane, voice slicing through the moment. Ma'am, I need you to take your seat immediately, or I'll be forced to notify the captain you're interfering with the flight crew. Devin stopped mid-sentence. I'm not interfering. I said sit down. Shaq turned to Colette, his eyes heavy but restrained. She's confirming what happened. She is escalating a safety situation. I'm trying to de-escalate it, Devin replied louder now, by telling the truth. The younger attendant, Eric, stepped in between them, hands raised in polite panic. Let's keep things calm, okay? Everyone please take your seats. We're working on resolving the issue. Devin didn't sit, not right away. She looked at Shaq, then at Jabria, now visibly trembling despite her father's best efforts to block the tension. Then finally, she nodded and returned to her row, but not without making it clear she had seen, and she wasn't going to forget. Shaq turned back to the cabin. That's all I was asking for, just one person to tell the truth. Again, the silence. But it was different now. It wasn't clean silence. It was ashamed silence. That mattered. He walked back toward his row, every footstep echoing louder than any shout could have. He sat beside Jabria, wrapping one arm around her and checking her pulse ox monitor again. Still climbing, not dangerous yet. But that line was getting closer. He took slow breaths, trying to get her to match them. You're okay, he whispered. I'm here. You're okay. Jabria nodded, barely. Across the aisle, a woman leaned toward her husband and whispered something. Behind them, someone whispered, why would they even take the bag? Another responded, he's being dramatic. A third added, I just want to get where we're going. And so it spread, the usual fracture of public morality. Half bothered by injustice, the other half bothered that it disrupted their schedule. From the front of the plane, Colette picked up the service phone again, murmuring into the receiver. A minute later, the intercom buzzed. This is your captain. We're experiencing a delay due to a passenger issue. Please remain seated while we clarify a few things. Thank you for your patience. Shaq scoffed under his breath. Passenger issue. As if this was a minor paperwork snag. The irony wasn't lost on him. How often black families were painted as chaotic, loud, disruptive, even when all they asked for was what they were owed: safety, dignity, truth. He stood again. Not all the way into the aisle this time, but just enough to speak. I know some of you just want to get to New York. You didn't come here for this, but this isn't something we asked for either. My daughter's medical bag was taken without permission. We are being told to stay quiet, sit still and let it slide. But if this was your child, if you saw her breathing like this, if you knew what could happen without that medicine, would you sit still? A few heads turned, some nodded, others still didn't move. Now I'm not asking anyone to fight, I'm not trying to delay your plans, but I'm asking, again, if anyone else saw what happened, if anyone else is willing to confirm the truth, now is the time. A pause. Then a voice, faint, male, from row 17. I saw her too. A man in his early 50s, glasses, blazer wrinkled from travel. He didn't stand, but he raised his hand. I was reading, but I saw the attendant reach up, take the bag and walk forward. I assumed she had a reason, but I remember thinking, it felt wrong. Shaq nodded. Thank you. A younger passenger, this time a girl in her early 20s, added softly, I saw it too. I just didn't know if I was supposed to say anything. And just like that, the silence cracked. Not completely, not loudly, but the edges had begun to fray. People were starting to admit they knew. Devon Creed looked back from her seat and gave a small nod of solidarity. Colette didn't speak again, not right away. Her face was locked in the same neutral expression flight crews wear when they're deeply uncomfortable, but trying to act like it's all just policy. But now she knew, this wasn't invisible anymore. Shaq sat back down beside Jabria, his frame shielding her from the growing eyes. He checked his phone. The signal was weak, but there was just enough of a bar. He typed quickly, a message to his assistant, then a short social post draft. He hadn't planned to go public. Not today, not like this, but if no one else was going to protect his daughter's story, then he would. He sent it. 3 sentences, no hashtags. Just the truth. On a Delta flight attendant took my 10-year-old daughter's asthma medication from the overhead and had it removed. No warning, no explanation. Still waiting on the ground. No one's accountable yet. He hit send, then turned off the screen. And somewhere above the clouds they still hadn't reached, truth began to fly on its own. Proof always comes late, but it hits hard. Shaq sat there with the weight of 2 worlds pressing against his chest. One was his daughter's slowing breath against his ribs, and the other was the stifling silence of an entire plane pretending nothing had happened. He had done everything right, spoke calmly, asked questions, sought witnesses, and though a few had finally spoken, it wasn't enough to force action. The pilot had gone silent again, the attendants were performing damage control, whispering in pairs at the front, and Colette had disappeared behind the curtain like an actor ducking off stage between scenes. But this wasn't a play, this was real, and real was suffocating. He looked down at Jabria, her head now resting on his lap, her small hands gripping the edge of his hoodie. She wasn't in distress yet, but her breathing was uneven, irregular, a little too fast for comfort. Her smart band showed her oxygen levels were just above warning. It was the in-between zone, not critical yet, but not stable either. She looked up at him and tried to smile. I'm okay, she whispered, voice thin. But he knew better. He reached for his phone again. Not to post, not to call, just to double-check his calendar. Maybe distract his mind for 30 seconds while they waited for the captain to come to his senses. He tapped the screen and swiped through apps. Notifications flooded in, text from friends, missed calls from his assistant, 2 alerts from his foundation's press manager asking, do we need to intervene, and 1 from a national outlet already requesting a comment. It hadn't even been 20 minutes since he hit send. That's how fast truth traveled now. But the right kind of truth, the kind that hits where it hurts, needed more than just words. It needed proof. That's when he noticed the voice recorder icon flashing at the top of the screen. Confused, he tapped into it. The file was timestamped 15 minutes earlier. It had been recording ever since they boarded. He turned to Jabria. Did you hit record by accident? She looked up slowly, blinking once. I was playing with the voice memo app. I didn't mean to start it. He held her hand. You did good, baby. He pulled out his earbuds, inserted one into his right ear, and hit play. At first it was just white noise, the shuffle of coats, the buzz of safety announcements. But then, clearer than he expected, came Colette's voice. Too bulky for the bin. And frankly, if she needs meds that bad, maybe she shouldn't be flying. Shaq froze. Played it back. Slower this time. Louder. The tone in her voice wasn't just dismissive. It was casual cruelty, dipped in protocol and indifference. It wasn't that she misunderstood. It was that she didn't care. He closed the file, then opened it again. Played it twice more to be sure. And then he stood up. The cabin was still mid-limbo. Engines quiet, people murmuring, the delay stretching longer than expected. Passengers had begun checking their watches and rolling their eyes, annoyed at the inconvenience of the standoff they were pretending wasn't happening. He didn't say anything right away. He walked calmly down the aisle to row 16, then 14, then 11. People watched him like they always did, expecting the physical, bracing for the explosive. But instead, Shaq held up his phone like it was a match in the dark. Some of you didn't know what happened, he said, and some of you did. But now there's no excuse. This isn't my opinion. This isn't interpretation. This is her voice, saying it. He tapped the screen and turned the volume to max. The audio played through the cabin, sharp and undeniable. Too bulky for the bin, and frankly, if she needs meds that bad, maybe she shouldn't be flying. A sharp intake of breath came from a few rows behind. A woman put her hand over her mouth. A man in first class leaned into the aisle. The air, which had already been tense, now crackled. You could feel it, that moment when disbelief turns into confirmation. That sharp twist in the gut when you realize you weren't just being paranoid. It did happen, and it wasn't just bad judgment. It was something uglier. Shaq continued walking, phone still raised. That bag wasn't just medication. It was safety. It was dignity. It was the thing that lets my daughter go to school, fly to visit her grandma, run outside without fear. And she took it like it was a gym bag, tossed it like it didn't matter. He stopped at row 10 and faced the front. "You want to talk about disruptions?" he asked. "Let's talk about what happens when people with power decide some lives don't deserve protection." Phones were up now, at least a dozen. Passengers recording, not just the moment, but the shift. What had been a murky situation of hearsay had now been illuminated by clarity. Real words, real damage. From the front of the cabin, Colette emerged from behind the curtain. Her posture was stiff. Her lips were drawn tight, but her face had lost all its color. She looked at Shaq, then at the passengers, then at the phone, and she knew. Eric, the young flight attendant beside her, whispered something too soft to hear. She didn't respond. Her hands stayed at her sides. Shaq lowered the phone, but his voice stayed strong. "This is the part where you apologize, not just to me, to her." He gestured toward Jabria, who was now sitting up, eyes wide and frightened, but watching. Colette didn't move. Shaq stepped aside, not blocking her path, but daring her to take it. The pilot's voice broke in over the intercom again. "We're aware of the recording. We are pausing departure for further review. Please remain seated." That did it. The shift from emotional pressure to administrative consequences. The murmurs turned to movement. Passengers began calling out. "That's unacceptable. She said that about a child? She needs to be removed." This is a lawsuit waiting to happen. For the first time, the tide had turned, not just in support, but in demand. People wanted accountability now, because now they weren't just witnesses. They were part of the story, captured in it, linked. Devon Creed stood again from her seat. "She needs that medicine. It can't be stored in cargo. If it's been exposed to heat or pressure variance, it may no longer be usable. That's medical negligence." Shaq looked at her and nodded his thanks. And then from the far end of the cabin, someone stood. Not a supporter, but a man in a crisp sport coat with thinning hair, clearly trying to assert control. "I don't know what the issue is, but can we just get on with the flight?" he said. "This is wasting everyone's time." Shaq turned to him slowly, voice still calm. "Do you have a child?" The man hesitated. "Yes." "Then imagine your child couldn't breathe. Imagine someone took the only thing that kept them safe, and then imagine everyone else telling you to move on." The man sat down. No one backed him up. Eric, still standing near Colette, took a cautious step forward. "We've radioed the gate. They're sending a supervisor to review the situation. The plane will remain at the gate until that's resolved." Shaq nodded. "Then I'll stay standing until it is." And he did. He returned to row 22, held Jabria's hand again, and let the cabin hum around him. His phone kept buzzing. News outlets, civil rights groups, old teammates asking what was happening. But he ignored them all. The story wasn't over yet. The damage had been done, but now the truth had weight. It was real, and it was rolling downhill fast. And somewhere behind the cold walls of the terminal, the airline's corporate team had just realized this wasn't going to go quietly. He tried the polite route. They shut him down. Shaq had never seen the inside of an airplane feel this tight. Not when he used to fly across oceans. Not even when he'd flown into war zones on USO tours. But now the air inside Flight 392 had taken on a pressure of its own. Not from altitude, not from sealed cabin doors, but from the unspoken weight of fear, anger, and the thick haze of inconvenient truth. That kind of atmosphere didn't show up on sensors. It built itself, quietly, when people in power refused to do the right thing. He sat in his seat, still holding his phone, the recording now echoing across timelines and inboxes. But the only response that mattered hadn't come yet. The flight crew had made it clear. They would not return the bag. No apology, no course correction, just vague reassurances, delays, and now, silence. That kind of silence, Shaq knew well. It was strategy. Delay the problem long enough, and maybe the press cycle rolls on. Maybe the passenger cools down. Maybe the whole thing disappears. But this time, they had picked the wrong man, and the wrong father. Shaq stood up again and approached the front of the plane. The pilot's door was closed but not locked. Eric, still pale and uncertain, stood near the jump seat. Colette had retreated into the galley, but her voice still carried, low, hushed tones to someone on the headset, spinning it, reframing it, rewriting the narrative in real time. Shaq cleared his throat, loud enough to be heard, calm enough not to startle. "I'm requesting to speak to the pilot directly." Eric shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, the captain is busy coordinating with ground ops." "I understand that, but this is now a medical issue and a legal one. He needs to call it in." Eric hesitated. "I'm not authorized." "You don't have to authorize it," Shaq said, his voice lowering but sharpening. "You just have to relay the request. I'll wait." He stood still. Every second passed like glass dragging across tile. Finally, the cockpit door cracked open. Captain Ryder Quinlan leaned out, eyes scanning Shaq with a mixture of guarded curiosity and that familiar brand of pilot confidence. Part calculation, part avoidance. He had the look of a man who had seen turbulence and believed he could manage it from 30,000 feet. But this was different. This was closer than the clouds. "Mr. O'Neill," the captain said, nodding. "We've been made aware of the situation. And we're reviewing it with our ops team." Shaq folded his arms. "You've heard the recording." "I did. And you're still preparing to take off?" "There are protocols," Quinlan said. "We're following them. Protocols don't account for negligence. My daughter's medicine was taken. She is not okay. I'm requesting the plane stay grounded and that ground control is contacted. We're not in the air yet. This can still be corrected." The captain's expression tightened. "If she's in medical distress, we can request EMTs on the jetway." Shaq's jaw tensed. "She doesn't need an ambulance. She needs her medication. That your crew removed without consent." Quinlan glanced at Eric, then back to Shaq. "If you continue to stand and escalate, we may be forced to contact airport security." And just like that, there it was. The script. The shift. The language that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with control. The same phrases Shaq had seen weaponized against men like him. Disruptive, escalating, aggressive, all meant to shrink a person down to a threat. Erase the parent. Ignore the pain. "Let me get this straight," Shaq said, not backing down. "Your flight attendant took a black child's life-saving medicine, ignored policy, and now I'm the problem?" The captain didn't respond. The door began to close. Shaq took a step back, not pushing, not yelling, just making space for what he knew was coming. He turned back toward the cabin and scanned the rows of watching faces. Some eyes dropped again. Others stared full on, unsure if they were witnessing a headline in the making, or just another uncomfortable moment they could ignore. Then came Colette, right on cue. She stepped forward with a clipboard, and the firm stiffness of someone who believed paperwork protected her from consequences. "I need to document this as a passenger interference incident," she said flatly. Shaq laughed under his breath, incredulous. "You interfered with my daughter's health. I interfered with nothing." "Sir, your refusal to remain seated has delayed this flight, disrupted the cabin, and made multiple crew members feel unsafe." "Unsafe?" he repeated. "You took a child's medicine and threw it away. And now that I won't pretend it didn't happen, you're scared?" Eric looked visibly uncomfortable. He stepped between them, holding a hand up. Let's lower our voices." Shaq didn't move. He addressed the cabin now. "You all heard the recording. You know what was said. And now they're trying to flip the script, make me the danger, because I won't sit quiet." A ripple moved through the cabin again. A few more phones lifted. Filming resumed. Devin Creed stood again, voice firmer this time. "I'm a licensed RN. If you call airport police instead of calling ground control and accessing that child's medical kit, you're opening yourselves up to serious liability." The captain's voice returned over the speaker, hollow and clipped. "We're advising all passengers to remain calm. We are following proper procedures and coordinating with the airline." Shaq leaned into the aisle, speaking without yelling, just loud enough to carry. "There's a difference between procedure and accountability. You're following one and avoiding the other." Colette bristled again, but she didn't respond. Then from row 8, a man raised his hand. Mid-30s, khaki jacket, glasses. "I work in HR compliance. What's happening here isn't defensible. If this were a white child whose medical bag had been removed, we wouldn't still be sitting here having this discussion." And that was it. A few others started nodding. Someone near the back chimed in. "He's right." A woman across the aisle added, "This isn't just a mistake, it's prejudice." Then another voice, "They're hoping we stop caring before it takes off." The pressure had changed. No longer just Shaq against the crew. Now it was something collective. The narrative had turned. Colette tried again. "Sir, please stop involving the cabin." Shaq turned to her slowly, firmly. "You involved them the moment you lied." She went quiet. A red-faced supervisor finally arrived through the front door, radio on his hip, clipboard in hand. He glanced around, took in the atmosphere, and clearly realized this wasn't a contain and calm scenario. This was about to hit the media hard. He walked directly to the captain, and the two began a heated but quiet exchange. Shaq watched them, hands steady at his sides. Jabria remained seated, now wrapped in the blanket Devon had passed over earlier. Her monitor still showed elevated vitals, but not critical. Not yet. After several minutes, the supervisor finally approached Shaq. "Mr. O'Neill," he said carefully, "we're going to deplane for further review. This flight will not continue until we've investigated the situation fully." Shaq didn't smile, just nodded. "That's all I asked." Passengers began murmuring again, some frustrated, others relieved, but no one dared challenge it now. The tide had turned too clearly. As Shaq gathered their things, Colette stood off to the side, arms folded. For the first time, she didn't look smug, she looked scared. Shaq passed her on the way out. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Because now the world was watching. Sometimes it just takes one person to stand up. Then others follow. The door of the aircraft hadn't opened yet. The engines were still idling, the jetway untouched. But inside Flight 392, something had changed. There was no official announcement, no alarm or dramatic confrontation, just a growing pulse, a subtle shift in weight as the truth that had been contained for too long began pressing against the walls. The recording had cracked the silence. The confrontation with the captain had bent the illusion of authority. But the cabin still sat in a fragile balance, passengers floating between discomfort and courage, unsure which one would carry them further. Shaq remained seated beside Jabria, her head leaning against his arm. She was tired now, not just from the anxiety, but from the invisible cost of knowing too much too young. Her breathing had steadied slightly, thanks to Devon's makeshift interventions and the controlled calm of her father's presence. Still, the medicine she needed was gone. Mishandled, discarded. Her pulse ox hovered at the edge of safe, monitored carefully from a watch that beeped too softly for the rest of the plane to hear. Shaq hadn't spoken for several minutes. He didn't need to. He had already said the most dangerous thing in that space, the truth. And then, from the middle of the plane, someone stood. A white woman, mid-30s, soft-featured but with a spine that hadn't bowed even though her face said she wasn't used to attention. She wore a tan cardigan and square-rimmed glasses. The kind of person most passengers had probably looked past, but now she stepped into the aisle with hesitation wrapped in resolve. "My name is Laura Pennington," she said, her voice trembling at first. "I'm a school counselor in Charlotte, and I saw what happened." Heads turned. The rustle of movement flicked through rows like wind in dry grass. "I saw the flight attendant Colette reach into the overhead bin and take the black bag. I was in row 15, across the aisle. I saw her walk it to the front without asking. I thought maybe it was for storage, but when Mr. O'Neill came back and asked for it, and she pretended like it was no big deal." Her voice caught for a moment. She looked down, then back up. "I didn't say anything at first. I told myself it wasn't my business. But then I heard the recording, and I realized I was watching something I've seen too many times, something I've stayed silent about for too long." A hush fell. "I work with kids every day, and I've seen the difference in how they're treated. In schools, in stores, in public. This wasn't just about a bag. It was about who's allowed to be protected, who's expected to sit quietly, who we believe without evidence. I'm not here to speak over anyone, but I'm not going to pretend I didn't see it." She looked back at Shaq, then down at Jabria. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner." There was a pause, long and warm and heavy. Then from row 19, a voice broke in. "I saw it too," said a man in a deep accent, Hispanic, early 40s, seated with a small girl next to him. "My name is Mateo Delgado. I didn't want to say anything, because of how people look at you when your English isn't perfect. But I saw her take the bag too. She didn't ask, she just grabbed it. And I saw how the little girl looked after scared." He placed a hand on his daughter's head. "I know what it means when you feel like no one will help you. So I want to help now." Someone in row 7 clapped once, unsure, then stopped. Then from the rear of the plane, a teenager stood, tall, dark-skinned, maybe 16, oversized hoodie, and a backpack half-zipped. "My name's Damon. I don't know these people. I don't know him." He nodded toward Shaq. "But I know what it's like to be seen as a problem before you open your mouth." I heard what she said. I saw how she looked at the girl, like she wasn't real, like she was in the way. He pointed forward. You took her medicine, and now you're trying to flip it, like you're the one in danger, but you're not. No one interrupted, not even the crew. Damon's words hung in the air like wire. Colette had reappeared now, just behind Eric. Her face had lost its professional gloss. Her posture wasn't smug anymore. It was rigid, almost stunned. Her eyes darted across the cabin, searching for some sort of lifeline, some authority she could rely on to fix what had unraveled. But no one moved to help her. She wasn't the authority anymore. She was the exposed one. Shaq stood again, slowly, and turned to face the rows of standing passengers. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The room was already leaning toward him. I didn't ask anyone to stand, he said. I didn't expect it, but I'll tell you this, I'm grateful. He gestured to Jabria. She's watching. She's watching how the world reacts when someone like her is mistreated. She's watching who sits back and who stands up, and right now she's seeing something I didn't expect either. He turned back to Colette.
You still haven't apologized.
She opened her mouth, but whatever came next, it wasn't enough, or it never arrived. She turned away. More passengers were standing now, not shouting, not chanting, just standing, quietly, but with purpose. An older black man near the front, retired by the look of him, stood and nodded. A young mother nursing a baby rose with one arm holding the child, her other resting on the seat. Even the man who had earlier asked to just get going, now sat straight-backed, eyes locked forward like he had finally seen something he couldn't pretend wasn't real. Devon Creed came forward again, stepping past Rose with quiet dignity. If you're still refusing to release the medical bag, she said to Eric, you're now in violation of basic patient safety protocol, and as a nurse, I have a legal obligation to report that. Eric looked at her, then at Colette, then back at the cockpit. He picked up the intercom phone. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. We're requesting immediate clearance to open the cabin door. Ground supervisor advised. Medical bag to be retrieved. Flight delay in effect. The cabin exhaled. Not like the story was over, but like a pressure valve had just been released. Shaq sat down again, gently. Jabria leaned into his side. He looked at her. You okay? She nodded slowly. They stood up, she whispered. He smiled, brushing a curl away from her forehead. Yeah, they did. Outside, the jetway began to move. The plane hadn't gone anywhere yet, but inside it had already landed in a very different place. Truth, once spoken, had found its echo. And in aisle 16, the silence had finally broken. Authority has a choice, justice or comfort. Captain Ryder Quinlan had spent 2 decades in the sky. Turbulence didn't shake him, unruly passengers didn't rattle him, and weather delays didn't so much as crack his calm. He had flown over war zones, emergency landed once on an iced runway in Kansas, and navigated a fuel shortage with 140 souls on board. But in all his years of flying, he'd never faced what now sat quietly in row 22. A father who wouldn't back down, a child whose breath had become a battleground, a cabin no longer ruled by safety announcements, but by truth. Ryder stood just inside the cockpit, his hand resting on the doorframe as he listened to Eric, the flight attendant whose voice now quivered between professionalism and quiet panic. Behind Eric, Colette paced in a tight triangle, her arms crossed, her face growing stonier by the second. Passengers had spoken, witnesses had named her, phones were still rolling, but she refused to retreat from the role she'd cast herself in, the enforcer of order. They're escalating, she said sharply. You need to make a call, this is becoming a safety risk. Ryder studied her face. He had worked with Colette 3 times before. She was precise, punctual, and policy-driven, and he remembered thinking she was someone who didn't let the job slip into chaos. But now, he saw something else. Not duty, not professionalism, something harder, something cold. This wasn't about aviation protocol anymore. This was personal. This was power trying not to lose. Where's the medical bag now? He asked quietly. Colette hesitated. It was placed with ground cargo. Was it properly flagged? No, it wasn't supposed to leave the plane. Ryder looked away. That admission alone was enough to end a career. But the damage wasn't only procedural, it was human. And now it was viral. He pulled out his tablet, opened the internal communication feed, and watched as alerts flooded in from operations. Social media incident involving Shaquille O'Neal. Recording of flight crew comments circulating. Major outlets requesting statement. Stand by for corporate instructions. He closed the tablet and looked back toward the cabin. The door hadn't opened yet. Ground control hadn't yet authorized full deboarding. likely because they didn't want a spectacle on the tarmac. But this was already a spectacle. A contained one. A quiet one. But it was burning. He moved down the aisle slowly, his pilot's cap tucked beneath one arm. The passengers watched him like a jury awaiting verdict. Some looked hopeful, others guarded. Shaq didn't rise as Ryder approached. He remained seated beside Jabria, one arm protectively draped around her, her head resting gently against his side. She wasn't asleep, just tired in that way kids get when they've had to absorb too much fear for too long. Ryder stopped at their row and crouched slightly, bringing himself eye level with Shaq. "Mr. O'Neill," he said, voice even, "I want to find the best way forward." Shaq nodded once. "Then it starts with bringing back what should never have been taken. I understand that the bag was removed without your permission. I also understand the recording has made clear what was said and done. But we have procedures now that involve coordinating with airport security, health compliance, and corporate counsel." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "All of that, but not the one thing that matters, returning her medication." Ryder took a breath. At this moment, the bag is no longer retrievable from cargo until after full deboarding and baggage reprocessing. "That's not a system issue," Shaq said, calm but firm. "That's a refusal to act, and I'm telling you now, Captain, we're not going anywhere until it's returned or replaced." The words weren't shouted. They were level, steady, but they carried weight, and the cabin felt it. The passengers stilled. The air shifted again. Ryder knew this feeling, the moment when leadership stopped being about control and started being about choice. "You're putting me in a difficult position," he said. "No," Shaq replied. "She did. You're just the one holding the wheel now." Ryder looked past him toward the front of the cabin, where Colette had resumed whispering with another attendant. Her expression hadn't changed. She believed she was right, or at least entitled to be. "I've never had a passenger refuse takeoff over a single incident," Ryder said. "Then maybe it's time you did," Shaq answered. For a long moment, neither moved. The entire plane sat frozen, not in fear, but in expectation. And then, from a few rows up, Lara Pennington rose again. "You're not being asked to bend the rules," she said. "You're being asked to do what's right." Her voice was firmer this time. She wasn't trembling anymore. "If your crew had endangered a white child's safety, we wouldn't be having this debate. We'd be unloading the cargo, apologizing, and making it right." A ripple of agreement murmured through the rows. The energy was different now. It wasn't just support, it was demand. Ryder looked back at Shaq, who didn't blink. "You're not going to lose control of this plane, Captain," Shaq said. "You already did. What you do now just tells us if you're brave enough to admit it." For a split second, Ryder looked like he might speak, but no words came. He stepped back. He turned and walked toward the front of the plane, where the gate phone hung unused beside the jump seat. He picked it up, dialed a number, and waited. "Captain Quinlan requesting full delay hold. We need access to gate ramp personnel for cargo retrieval. Medical item mishandled. Yes, priority override required." He hung up and turned to Colette. "You're off this flight." "What?" she snapped, louder than she meant. "I'm removing you from crew duty pending investigation. Sit in the jump seat until relieved." "But, that's an order." She stepped back, visibly rattled. Her composure cracked for the first time. She sat stiffly, avoiding eye contact with the passengers now watching her every move. Ryder walked back down the aisle and stopped beside Shaq once more. "They're bringing the bag. It may take 10 minutes. I apologize." Shaq looked him in the eye. "That's a start." Jabria opened her eyes, looked at her dad, then the captain. She didn't say anything, but her expression changed, just slightly. The kind of change you see when a child realizes the world might respond when you speak up. 10 minutes passed. The door opened. A ground supervisor boarded with a sealed plastic bag marked Priority Medical, Do Not Delay. Inside was the black pouch, untouched. Shaq checked the contents instantly. Nebulizer intact. Inhalers undamaged. The digital monitor screen lit up as expected. It had made it. He knelt by Jabria, pulled out the inhaler she needed, and helped her guide it into her mouth. 2 deep breaths. A pause. Another 2. Her chest rose slower now, less strained. Her eyes fluttered closed in relief. "You good?" he whispered. She nodded. The captain didn't return to the intercom right away. The cabin sat in a delicate kind of peace, not the kind that follows resolution, but the kind that follows a long breath held too long. Shaq stood and turned toward the passengers. "I didn't do this to make a scene. I did it because she couldn't fight for herself, and if I let it go, how many more would get treated the same way?" No one answered. They didn't have to. Because now, there were witnesses. And justice no matter how delayed, had finally gotten clearance to land. What happens when the hero locks the plane from the inside? When the black pouch finally returned to row 22, the plane exhaled as if its walls had lungs of their own. But what should have been resolution didn't feel like one. Not yet. Yes, the medicine was safe. Yes, Jabria had taken her inhaler. And yes, the crew member responsible had been removed from duty. But even as the engines powered down and airport staff reappeared through the open front door, something hung thick in the cabin. A stillness not of rest but of expectation. Everyone knew this wasn't over. Not for the man in seat 22D, and certainly not for his daughter. Shaq sat quiet for a long time. He held the black pouch in his lap like a sacred object. Not because of what it cost, but because of what it almost cost them. Jabria leaned her head against his side again, her breathing now slow, regulated. Her tiny fingers wrapped around two of his. For a moment it seemed like he might finally settle. But Shaq didn't move like a man who was done. He moved like a man who had just started writing a chapter someone tried to tear out. The flight crew's replacement had arrived. A younger woman named Brielle, with wide eyes and shoulders pulled back tight with stress. She greeted the passengers with quiet apologies, offered water, nodded through the awkwardness, but she wasn't the problem. Everyone knew that. Still, protocol moved forward like a train, too big to steer. The captain, too, had retreated to his seat, officially removed from conflict. The airline's ground team advised that takeoff would resume shortly. They had de-escalated, checked the boxes, sanitized the narrative. Except the man in 22D hadn't signed off? Shaq stood again. Slow, deliberate. His body blocked the aisle for a beat too long, and those around him leaned back instinctively. But he didn't look down. He looked ahead, then left. Toward the emergency door just behind row 12, the one labeled in clear red letters, "Exit only, U is an emergency." He walked toward it, not fast, not panicked. He simply moved like someone who'd made a decision the room hadn't caught up to yet. People watched, unsure what they were seeing. A few phones raised again. Filming resumed. Shaq reached the door and didn't touch it. Not directly. He didn't yank a handle. He didn't threaten anything. He simply turned and leaned against it, arms crossed, blocking it with the kind of body no one could move without asking for trouble. Not the violent kind, but the kind that comes when a man refuses to vanish. The cabin stirred.
What's he doing?
Someone whispered. Is he trying to get off the plane? No, said another voice. He's not leaving, he's keeping us here. Shaq cleared his throat, then spoke. Calm, controlled, louder than a conversation, quieter than a speech. This isn't about me, he said. It never was. He looked toward the back of the plane, then slowly scanned across every row. This is about every kid who's ever been told to sit down when they were scared. Every parent who's been asked to calm down while their child was being ignored. Every brown child who got treated like a burden instead of a passenger. His voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. We just watched a crew member throw away a child's medical device, lie about it, try to frame a father as a threat, and what? Because they got caught on tape, we're supposed to move on now? Pretend it didn't happen? He shook his head. They didn't just try to humiliate me. They tried to erase my daughter's dignity. They tried to flip the script, paint me as aggressive, say I was disrupting. And if there hadn't been a recording, if a few of you hadn't stood up. He paused. We'd be in the air right now, with a sick child and no medicine. And every headline would say the same thing it always says. Passenger escalates incident. Shaq looked at the camera lens of a phone, now hovering from row 14. Not today. The social feeds erupted in real time. Clips of his words hit Twitter, then Instagram, then the news wires. Hashtags spread. Not Big Shaq won't fly. Grounded for truth. She needed her meds. Flight 392, still motionless on the tarmac, became a national broadcast without ever leaving the ground. A flight supervisor stepped onto the plane again. Headset tilted, mouth open like he had rehearsed something corporate. But he stopped short at the sight of Shaq calmly posted against the exit door. He blinked, adjusted his belt, and backed away without saying a word. The pilot returned to the cockpit. Again, no announcement, no bold claim, just silence. Passengers whispered, eyes darting toward one another for cues. Shaq spoke again. I know this makes some of you uncomfortable. Maybe you just wanted to get where you were going. I understand, but when people like me, people like her, he gestured to Jabria, stay silent. The system never changes, so today we're not going anywhere until they acknowledge what happened, publicly, fully, not just an apology behind a closed door. I want this airline to say out loud that what happened was wrong, that no child should be treated this way, that no father should be punished for protecting his own. He paused again, letting the weight of it settle. This plane stays grounded until the truth takes flight. A beat of silence. Then Lara Pennington stood up again. I'll stay seated until then too. Then Mateo Delgado. Me too. Then Devin Creed. Then Damon. And then, a wave. Row after row, one by one. Some stood, some remained seated, but raised their hands. Not in protest, not in rebellion, just in solidarity. Shaq didn't smile. Not exactly, but his eyes changed. A flicker of something warm behind the steady fire. A new flight manager entered with a clipboard and a flustered expression. He approached the front, then froze. We're still grounded, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. And we've got half a cabin refusing to fly. The captain appeared once more, his face thinner than before, humbled. Not broken, but remeasured. He met Shaq's eyes and spoke low. They're drafting a statement. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Who? Corporate. And when will we hear it? The captain hesitated. Before takeoff, or this flight doesn't leave. Shaq nodded once. That's the first smart call you've made. The pilot turned and walked back toward the cockpit. Minutes later, an intercom chime rang out.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. On behalf of the airline, we acknowledge a serious error was made aboard this aircraft today. A child's life was put at risk due to mishandling of medical equipment. The comments made by one of our crew members were unacceptable. We are reviewing all procedures and issuing a formal apology to the O'Neill family and the other passengers affected.
The cabin buzzed. Heads turned. Some clapped. A few sniffled. Shaq pushed off from the door and returned to row 22. He didn't say thank you. Not yet. Not until it was real. But Jabria looked up at him now, eyes wide and full of something not just grateful but proud. You locked the plane, she said quietly. No, he replied. We unlocked something bigger. And with that, the aircraft remained grounded. Not because of bad weather, not because of a delay, but because someone stood in front of a door and refused to fly until the truth was heard. The world is watching. The airline just didn't know it yet. By the time Flight 392 finally lifted off the runway, the real altitude wasn't measured in feet, but in attention. The seatbelt sign had barely flickered on before phones lit up again. Not with games, not with movies. With the news breaking, spreading, evolving in real time. The cabin was quiet, but the outside world was anything but. Shaq won't fly was now a top 3 trending topic. A video snippet of Shaq calmly leaning against the emergency door had been shared over 500,000 times in under 30 minutes. One clip, barely 20 seconds long, featured his words with subtitles. We're not going anywhere until they acknowledge what happened. It was reposted by athletes, musicians, school teachers, activists, airline workers. Celebrities added their voices, not with crafted statements but stunned replies. Shaq did what? This is what parenting looks like. I'd ground the world too if someone came for my baby. The airline's PR division hadn't prepared for this. Not the scale, not the face, not the evidence. It wasn't just that a mistake had been made. It was that the one person they hadn't expected to stand firm in the eye of corporate control was the one who wouldn't budge. And now the court of public opinion was seated, watching, recording every second. Shaq sat quietly in his seat again, head tilted slightly, gaze out the window. The sky stretched wide and clear. But even here, cruising high above clouds, he wasn't relaxing. He couldn't. Not when the system that had nearly failed his daughter was still intact. Jabria had finally drifted to sleep against his side, her head nestled in the corner between his arm and the cabin wall, wrapped in a blanket that a fellow passenger had offered earlier. He adjusted her monitor again. Vitals were stable. Not great, but stable. It was enough for now. Enough to breathe, even if the tension hadn't left his chest. 2 rows up, a woman had her laptop out. She wasn't watching a movie. She wasn't checking emails. She was writing, precise, purposeful, quietly typing away. She wore a simple blazer, black slacks, and her bag had a patch sewn into the strap, Know Your Rights. Her name was Ayanna Locke, a civil rights attorney based in D.C., in the air on her way to a hearing involving school discrimination. She hadn't spoken earlier, not because she was indifferent, but because she was building something, quietly, strategically, observing everything, cataloging it all in real time. Now she was outlining a potential class action strategy, not just for Jabria, but for families who had been silenced mid-air before. She'd already bookmarked 3 similar cases. She'd already typed out a demand letter draft to the airline's legal division. Shaq didn't know who she was yet, but soon he would. Back in row 18, Damon was scrolling TikTok. His clip, The one where he'd said you looked at her like she wasn't real had been reshared by a teachers' union account and a pro-athlete coalition. For the first time in his life, his voice had power that echoed, and he was stunned by it. He wasn't just a kid with a camera anymore. He was part of something bigger than the moment. In the galley, the replacement crew whispered into their own headsets, waiting for updates from corporate. Brielle had taken over lead duties, but she hadn't said more than was necessary. She moved through the cabin with care, avoiding empty courtesy. Just quiet kindness, water refills, blanket offers, space when needed. She had seen the recording too. Her phone had buzzed during takeoff with it. And though she couldn't say it out loud, she knew the flight she had stepped into wasn't a regular leg. It was history in motion. In first class, the man who had earlier demanded they just get on with it sat folded into himself. He hadn't spoken again. He didn't tweet. He didn't post. But he'd seen his reflection in the silence, the way his impatience had almost joined the weight of injustice. And now he sat watching Shaq, not as a celebrity, but as a father. The kind he hadn't been brave enough to be when his own son was discriminated against last year, and he stayed silent at the school board meeting. Regret is a powerful listener. The pilot made no further announcements. The intercom stayed silent, except for routine altitude updates. The cockpit was still not out of pride, but out of consequence. Corporate had warned them. Any further misstep could compound liability. The cabin belonged to the moment now, and the moment was listening. The airline's social team, locked in a backroom conference across the country, scrambled. They were crafting statements, testing word combinations that could soften the blow. We are aware of the incident, committed to training. We stand with families. But none of it landed. Not after a father had blocked a flight with silence and stillness. Not after millions had seen his daughter's trembling fingers. Truth isn't softened by branding. Meanwhile, Jabria stirred gently and looked up at her dad. Are we flying now? Yeah, baby, Shaq said, rubbing her back. We're in the air. She blinked, disoriented. Is everyone still mad? He smiled, faint but warm. Some of them were never mad. They were just quiet. They're not quiet now. Jabria nodded. She didn't understand the headlines. She didn't know what trending meant. But she understood this. People had stood up for her, because her dad wouldn't sit down. She pulled the blanket tighter, resting her head again. You stopped the plane. He looked out the window. No, he said quietly. You did. A few rows back, Ayanna Locke finished typing the last paragraph of her letter. She saved the document and opened her calendar. There would be meetings, press requests, depositions. But she didn't flinch. This wasn't the first time she'd seen a system crack. But it was the first time she'd seen a former NBA player hold a plane hostage with a father's calm and a child's truth. An alert came through her email. Request from Civil Liberties Watch. Media interest in Flight 392. She closed her laptop. Enough for one ride. Somewhere over the Carolinas, Flight 392 sailed quietly toward its original destination. But it was no longer just a commercial aircraft. It was now a vessel of memory, of witness, of what happened when a black father refused to apologize for defending his daughter's breath. And somewhere below, millions of people looked up from their phones, read the same hashtag, watched the same clip, and whispered the same truth. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just didn't move. And the world finally moved with him. Not just this plane. The whole system's coming down. It was supposed to be a short flight. Atlanta to New York. A little under 2 hours in the air. Just enough time to rise above the noise and come back down before it could follow. But the sky had shifted. Somewhere between the gate and the clouds, Flight 392 had become something else. Not a journey, but a junction. Not a delay, but a decision. And while the altitude climbed, the pressure on the ground exploded. The airline's executive floor, thousands of miles from the cabin, had turned into a war room. Senior staff clustered around phones, reading updates from media outlets and legal teams, watching trending hashtags roll like storm clouds across their screens. This wasn't a PR hiccup anymore. This was a reckoning, and the face of it was calm, immovable, and known by almost every household in the country. Shaquille O'Neal had become the voice of a story no corporation wanted told. Not because he shouted, not because he threatened, but because he sat in silence where others would have folded, and he made the world listen to the truth they tried to bury beneath policies and polite lies. The flight had reached halfway up the East Coast when the captain received the call that would alter its trajectory. It didn't come through the cockpit's standard dispatch channel. It came through a secure direct patch, the kind reserved for emergencies, dignitaries, or events that couldn't afford delay. Captain Quinlan listened. He didn't argue. He didn't even speak for most of it. When he hung up, he didn't make eye contact with his co-pilot. He simply toggled the intercom and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Due to new instructions from airline operations, we will be making an unscheduled return to Atlanta. Further updates will be shared shortly. Please remain seated. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was realization. Passengers who had spent the last hour watching clips and reading tweets didn't ask questions. They knew what this was. The flight wasn't just returning. The plane had been called back. In row 22, Shaq sat up a little straighter. Jabria, still drowsy from the medication, looked up. "We're going back?" "Yeah," he said. "We are." "They canceled it." He nodded. "They paused it. For now." She blinked slowly. "'Cause of me?" "No," he said, brushing a hand gently through her hair. "Because of us." From across the aisle, Lara looked over. Then Mateo. Then Devin. Then Damon. No one cheered. No one clapped. But something stronger than applause filled the air. Vindication. What they had witnessed. What they had stood up for. What they had risked their voices to support. It had forced the system to blink. Back in the cockpit, Captain Quinlan received the next instruction. Prepare the cabin. The CEO wanted to speak to Shaquille O'Neal directly. No press rep. No VP of Customer Relations. The top. Not because they respected him, but because they had no choice. When the wheels touched the tarmac, the aircraft slowed more deliberately than usual. Outside the windows, passengers began to notice something strange. Beyond the normal rows of baggage carts and fuel trucks, there were people. Dozens, maybe more. Some held signs, others held phones in the air. A few clapped as the jet turned toward the gate. The airport police didn't push them back, because this wasn't a protest. Not yet. This was a homecoming, for justice. Shaq felt the vibration of his phone in his hoodie. He pulled it out. A text, unknown number. "Hi, Mr. O'Neal. This is Jeremy Lasker, CEO of Meridian Airlines. I understand this message is long overdue. I'd like to speak with you directly before the cabin is released." He stared at the screen, then replied with 3 words. "I'll be here." A moment later, the lead attendant approached his row. "They've asked you to take the call up front. In the galley." Shaq shook his head. "No need. I'll take it here." She paused, then handed him the flight phone. Old-fashioned, still corded, still heavy. He pressed it to his ear. "This is Shaquille." The line buzzed softly, then a voice. "Mr. O'Neal, I want to start by apologizing. What happened aboard your flight today is not reflective of our company's values. We're conducting a full investigation. The crew member involved has been removed from duty indefinitely. We're also—" Shaq cut in. Not harshly. Just enough. "You've got lawyers writing this for you?" A pause. "Yes, but—" "Then let me be clear, Jeremy. I'm not calling for a refund. I'm not asking for compensation. This isn't about customer service. Of course, this is about how systems treat our children like cargo. This is about how people like your crew felt comfortable removing my daughter's medicine and turning her health into a security issue. This is about what happens every day to families who don't have millions of followers or a name you recognize. So don't tell me what you're conducting. Tell me what you're fixing." Jeremy's voice was quieter now. "We are implementing mandatory retraining, rewriting crew discretion policy, and assembling a passenger equity council. I'm also issuing a public apology within the hour." "You're not apologizing to me," Shaq said. "You're apologizing to her." He looked down at Jabria, who was now fully awake, listening. She'll never forget what it felt like when that bag disappeared. When people watched it happen and said nothing. But she'll also never forget that a few of them stood up. And neither will I. "I understand." "No," Shaq said calmly. "You don't, but you will." He handed the phone back to the attendant and stood. The doors hadn't opened yet. The crowd outside had grown. Airport staff held barriers, but not aggressively. Some even smiled. A few clapped softly. Then came the captain over the intercom. "Cabin crew, doors to arrival and cross-check." And just like that, it was over. Except it wasn't. As passengers began to stand, Shaq stayed seated with Jabria. He let others exit first. Lara passed, placing a hand on his shoulder. Mateo gave a quiet nod. Devin offered a soft "be well." Damon paused, unsure what to say, then simply said, "You're a good dad." When they finally stood, Shaq took Jabria's hand and walked slowly toward the front of the plane. She was small beside him, but she walked proud, not because she understood everything, but because she understood enough. As the door opened, the wave of sound from outside hit them. Claps, camera shutters, voices shouting his name. But Shaq didn't raise his hands. He didn't wave. He just walked forward, one step at a time, holding his daughter's hand like it was the only thing that ever mattered. News vans clustered near the fence line. Reporters held mics. But Shaq didn't stop. Outside, one reporter shouted, "Mr. O'Neill, what do you call this?" He turned. Just once. A landing. And then he kept walking. Because this wasn't about going somewhere. It was about making sure no one else got left behind. Shaq and Jabria stepped into that space together. He didn't release her hand. Not for a second. She walked half a step behind him, her fingers tight around his, her tiny backpack bouncing softly against her shoulder with every stride. She didn't flinch at the noise, not because she was fearless, but because she trusted the strength of the hand holding hers. The walk down the jet bridge wasn't long, but it felt like crossing a threshold, not just from plane to ground, but from private battle to public reckoning. It only takes one voice to break the silence, and one father to change a system. The moment the cabin door opened, a wall of light greeted them. Not sunlight, but camera flashes. Not warmth, but tension. And not just curiosity, but something more volatile. Anticipation. The kind that comes when a nation has held its breath too long, and now looks to one person to tell them how to exhale. Shaq didn't speak at first. He kept his head up, eyes forward. He wasn't here to perform. He was here to finish what had started 36,000 feet in the air. And somehow, his silence said more than the microphones ever could. Reporters leaned forward. Boom mics tracked their steps. Cameramen adjusted focus, but he walked past them all. The hallway was lined with airport security, media, and a scattering of staff trying to manage the crowd. Some of the flashing came from phones, some from press lenses, a few from people who didn't even know what had happened, only that something big had. But it didn't matter. The truth had already landed, and now it was walking through that tunnel, 6'7" and steady, with a child breathing easier at his side. Until someone called out a question that stuck. He paused, just a breath. Jabria looked up at him, waiting. "Mr. O'Neill, what would you say to the airline right now?" Then he turned, not toward the cameras, but toward her. There was no need for a press conference, no podium, no hashtags in that moment, just a father telling a truth that too many had swallowed for too long. "I'd say," he began, "that the sky don't belong to anybody. And if it ain't safe for our babies, we'll keep our feet on the ground until it is." The words hit like thunder through the press pit, not because they were loud, but because they landed where it hurt. He turned again and continued walking. Outside the terminal, the crowd had grown. Airport staff had set up barriers, but they couldn't contain the tide. Activists, families, everyday passengers. Some carried handmade signs. "Respect is not optional. She deserved better. Breathe, baby, breathe." They weren't blocking traffic or chanting slogans. They just stood, waiting, watching, holding space. The airline had scrambled together a formal apology, already posted on their social feeds, now being printed on placards inside the airport. The language was polished, but it arrived late, too late to matter. He didn't answer, not yet. Shaq and Jabria walked through the terminal's glass doors into the open air. The wind was cooler than expected for Atlanta this time of year. Jabria pulled her hoodie sleeves down over her hands and pressed against his side. A small news crew began trailing them from a distance. One of them shouted a question about lawsuits, another about whether Shaq planned to sue. Because this wasn't about money. It never had been. Down near the private pickup lane, a black SUV waited. Not tinted like a celebrity car, just nondescript, like someone trying to avoid a spectacle. Shaq opened the back door and let Jabria climb in. She buckled herself in without a word. He slid in beside her. And then it hit him. It wasn't chaos. It was clarity. A system that had run too long on quiet obedience had finally been interrupted by the weight of one voice. Before closing the door, he looked back once, toward the terminal. The crowd, the chaos. Inside the vehicle, the driver said nothing. He didn't need to. The atmosphere spoke for itself. Jabria leaned her head on Shaq's shoulder again. He shut the door. "Did I do okay?" she asked softly. He looked down. "You did more than okay. You didn't have to. You existed. And that was enough." I didn't talk much. One voice had cracked the silence. She thought about that for a moment, then nodded. Outside the windows, the crowd slowly faded behind them. The airport curved away. The phones kept buzzing, headlines updating faster than they could be read. Civil rights organizations were calling it a landmark moment. Airlines had begun reviewing their policies mid-flight. A growing list of parents and advocates were sharing their own stories online, not just of flights but of hospitals, schools, restaurants, offices, everywhere their children had been treated like less. And now the echo couldn't be stopped. Shaq's phone rang again. Not a reporter this time. not a lawyer. It was his mother, Lucille. He answered quickly. Hey, Ma. There was a pause. We're good. You good? She asked. I saw the video. You did right.
I figured.
He nodded slowly. I had to. No, she said. You chose to. That's different. Another pause.